Revolutionary Army was founded by Monkey D. Dragon, son of Monkey D. Garp and fatherman of Monkey D. Luffy. And this dragon was originally a marine following in Daddy Garp's footsteps. However, after witnessing the atrocities of the world government firsthand, Dragon decided that he could no longer serve the protection of this institution, and he would go on to found a group called the Freedom Fighters to combat small-scale injustices carried out on behalf of the world government. A group which would eventually evolve into the Revolutionary Army, which has the much larger goal of ripping the world nobles from their seats of power and fundamentally altering the governing structure of the planet. However, Dragon is a one-man, and a one-man alone would not be able to accomplish this, and so Dragon began to gather a team of exceptional allies, one of which was Bartholomew Kuma. During his time as a pastor and healer of the elderly in the Sorbet Kingdom, Kuma was inspired reading articles about Dragon and the Freedom Fighters, considering Dragon to be a hero, and inspiring Kuma to want to go out to sea one day and help others as well. And that day would come sooner than Kuma anticipated. After being thrown into prison by King Bakori, Kuma and his love interest Ginny would be rescued by Dragon and the Freedom Fighters, after which point the two of them promptly signed up for action. And for a while, Kuma got to become the hero that he envisioned. His buccaneer body combined with his devil fruit ability made him unstoppable, and it was partially through his sheer power and dedication that the Freedom Fighters were able to grow and expand into the Revolutionary Army. However, the stories of Kuma and Ginny would not end well, with Ginny being abducted by a world noble for a couple of years before promptly being dumped back onto the surface world to die with her baby jewelry Bonnie. At this point, Kuma began reducing and ultimately ceasing his revolutionary activities so that he could care for Ginny's daughter Bonnie following her death. And to speak more on exactly how the Revolutionary Army functions, operations are divided into 5 companies, each dedicated to operating in one of the 4 blues, as well as one to conduct missions in the Grand Line. Each of these armies has their own captain or commander. The term is used interchangeably depending on which translation you read or watch, as well as its own deputy captain or commander, with that term being used interchangeably for the same reason it is and I just said. And to start with Dragon's favorite direction, the earliest known captain of the East Army is the previously mentioned Ginny. During her time with the Revolutionary Army, she was insanely effective in her position of leadership, so much so that Ginny ended up owning a bounty of 190 million berries, which, for perspective, is almost twice the amount given to Luffy after he defeated Crocodile on Alabasta. Ginny, as with many One Piece flashback characters, was universally loved, and she was primarily known for her foul mouth. However, as previously stated, Ginny was abducted by a world noble 14 years ago, and sadly passed away after being deliberately infected with a disease known as sapphire scales, which Ginny would unfortunately pass down to her daughter Bonnie. Tragic stuff, but the revolution must continue. And it would be Belo Betty who would inherit Ginny's position as commander of the East Army. Belo Betty is one of the oldest known members of the Revolutionary Army, which is awkward given her actual age. Belo Betty is 34 years old in the modern day. However, her first chronological appearance in One Piece occurred 22 years ago as one of the members of the Freedom Fighters. And here you can see an allegedly 12-year-old Belo Betty who has matured impossibly quickly, and this is likely a continuity error from Oda. But following Ginny's abduction, Dragon, the leader of this Revolutionary Army, had not actually planned to name another East Army captain. He said that the position would eternally belong to Ginny. However, 4 years ago, Belo Betty asked Kuma if she could take on the role of commander, and Kuma gave his blessing, adding, and I quote, "So it takes a foul-mouthed woman to run the Eastern forces." And it's fair to say that Belo Betty has more than done Ginny proud in her time in leadership. Belo Betty is the user of the Kobu Kobu no Mi, the pump fruit, which allows her to awaken the latent potential within people via arousing speech, which also makes her one of the most valuable Revolutionary Army assets, as Belo Betty essentially has the ability to create terrifyingly powerful armies out of disenfranchised citizens wherever she is deployed. And as a result of this ability, it should be no surprise that Belo Betty is actually one of the most valuable women in the world. With a current bounty of 457 million berries, Belo Betty holds the second highest known bounty within the Revolutionary Army thus far, although realistically, Dragon almost certainly has a higher bounty than her, in addition to Sabo, who we'll explore later. But for now, Belo Betty's deputy commander of the East Army is Ahiru, a character who was created to fall into a couple of different trend buckets. Firstly, her name Ahiru means duck, which continues a long-standing tradition of Oda naming women after birds, such as Robin, Nojiko, Toshigi, Kuina, Hina, Suru, and Suru again. Ahiru is also the perfect example of a color swap character. Ahiru initially appeared in chapter 905, but was mistaken for a miscellaneous background character, and so she was given a very background character color scheme, which was later redesigned when it was revealed that Ahiru was actually a character of some prominence, and this situation is also referred to as the Marco effect. But in addition to that, our hero is yet another victim of the left arm curse. Shanks used to scared Basil Hawkins, Kiku, Nekomamushi, etc. Oda seems to have a hunger for removing specifically left arms, and our hero is also subject to said hunger. And her cybernetic arm allegedly has some sort of Iron Man shooting style capabilities, although we have yet to see this in action. This also has yet to be revealed, but I imagine that our hero has some sort of tragic backstory behind why she lost her arm, potentially due to the actions of the world government, and that may play into what inspired her to join the Revolutionary Army. Meanwhile, the person most likely responsible for constructing our hero's arm is the commander of the South Army, Lindbergh. His name is possibly inspired by Charles Lindbergh, an aviator, soldier, and most importantly, an inventor. However, Lindbergh is a particularly trigger-happy member of the Revolutionary Army, but it's not so much that he loves fighting, it's more so that he loves having an opportunity to test out all of his wacky weapon inventions that he develops with scientific and engineering knowledge on par with that of any given mad scientist, with the obvious exception of Dr. Vegapunk. And so Lindbergh is an essential element of the Revolutionary Army. He's the dedicated tech guy, and it's almost certainly his genius that's allowed the Revolutionary Army to build such an extensive network of communications, as well as arm its soldiers with all sorts of fun gadgets. Lindbergh was also briefly charged with restoring the cyborg body of Bartholomew Kuma before that Kuma reactivated and promptly ran away. Very rude. And of course, we should note that Lindbergh is a mink and therefore has access to a Sulong form, which I would assume he can control. And look, I assume that because this boy, he may look wacky, but during the assault on Marijois, he, along with Morley and Karasu, fought against two Marine admirals, Fujitora and Ryukugyu, and as restricted as the two admirals may have been, this is still an incredible feat, earning Lindbergh a bounty of 316 million berries, which almost makes him the most valuable mink in the series, but he is beaten out by Pecoms with a bounty of 330 million berries. But Lindbergh is supported by Deputy Commander of the South Army, Gambo, whose name is a straightforward reference to gambling, given that he takes every opportunity to make a bet. And this man is he's unusually rotund even for a One Piece character, and he may even be part of a special Humpty Dumpty balloon race, as we have seen others like him before with Big Mom's children, Charlotte Dolce and Draghi. Creatures who were just born to be round. Unfortunately, we don't know a lot more about Gambo at the time of this recording, except that that moustache was not always blue. This is another example of the Marco effect, as Gambo originally sported a much more boring collection of choices made by the intern working on the digitally colored manga. But to the North Army now, we meet Commander Karasu, a name which means crow, and that's his whole identity. Although he has one of the more fearsome designs due to the Plague Doctor-esque mask, which is actually another one of Lindbergh's inventions, as this mask functions as a speaker so that people can actually hear what Karasu's saying. Initially, you may think there's a tragic backstory behind this, something world government voice taken away, but no, Karasu, he's just a low talker. He always mumbles, and one day, Lindbergh just got sick of it. Karasu also happens to be the user of a very fun soot logia, which he often uses to transform himself into a flock of soot crows. And rather unusually, he can also speak through these crows as well, which is a unique ability that we've not seen any other logia user take advantage of before. And while we weren't introduced to Karasu until we met the rest of the army commanders, crazily enough, we did meet him pre-time skip all the way back in chapter 593, as one of his many bodily soot crows delivered a newspaper to the Revolutionary Army group who had just rescued Nico Robin, which informed her of Luffy's 3D2Y message, which is an idea that I love about Karasu. The fact that he mimics Big News Morgan's fleet of news crews who were officially charged with delivering newspapers around the world, and with Karasu's Logia crows acting as black market news crews. So Karasu is another essential element for the Revolutionary Army for them to have discreet and effective communication, with the world government deeming Karasu a danger worthy of a 400 million berry bounty, which is the amount that they awarded Luffy after his involvement in the Paramount War, so that should tell you something about the danger that they see in Karasu. A danger who is backed up by the Deputy Commander of the North Army, Jiren, who also has quite an unusual design for a One Piece character. There's a lot going on here, and that's because his character was inspired by Jiren Amos, the protagonist of Combat Mecha Jabangal, an anime series that ran from 1982 to 1983. And Oda potentially chose this character to inspire a Revolutionary Army member because this Jiren was fueled by his desire to take revenge for the murder of his parents. Or maybe not, because in the SBS volume 107, Oda said that he could only really remember Jiren's round face, and when he tried to draw it, well, out popped our One Piece Jiren. Jiren also happens to be rather fond of Gambo, the Deputy South Army Commander, primarily because it appears that Gambo funds Jiren's lifestyle, as Jiren always accepts Gambo's bets. However, he has a tendency of cheating, such as in chapter 1082 when a ship was approaching Momoira Island. Jiren suggested that they place a bet on Sabo's return, which Gambo accepted a little too quickly, and Jiren of course won this bet because before he'd proposed the bet, he had already seen Sabo on the ship using a telescope, which he then swiftly ate to get rid of the evidence. This may imply that Jiren is a devil fruit user and that he can perhaps create edible objects. We've seen many examples of that within the Charlotte family, specifically with the biscuit fruit, the butterfruit, and the cream fruit. Or this could be a Warpole style devil fruit that allows Jiren to eat regular objects. That, or he's just a completely normal person who ate a completely normal telescope to win a completely normal bet. No judgment, we've all been there. And setting our sights west, we immediately see the colossal Morley, commander of the West Army, although having sighted him is not great for us, because Morley has a habit of mistaking any attention for flirtation and generally proceeds to violently reject anything perceived as an advance. Which is a fun gag because Morley is a giant and therefore will always receive attention due to size alone, even though Morley is the shortest known giant in the series, standing at a mere 12.5 meters tall. At this stage, Morley also happens to be our first known giant Okama, or more specifically, Morley is a newcomer, which is very appropriate as Morley is a whopping 160 years old and our oldest known prisoner of Impel Down. In fact, it was actually Morley who was responsible for creating level 5.5, which in the future would become known as Newcomer Land, and Morley was able to achieve this with the Oshiyoshi no Mi, which gives Morley the ability to manipulate the ground, and with this power, Morley also became chronologically the first known prisoner to escape from Impel Down. And after joining the Revolutionary Army, Morley revealed this space to Dragon, which is why Dragon subsequently sent Emporio Ivankov and Inazuma into the prison to occupy it. And as with the other commanders, Morley's devil fruit abilities are essential to revolutionary operations, as despite being the most flamboyant giant to have ever lived, Morley is unparalleled when it comes to quiet infiltration. With Morley's deputy commander being Ushiano, a cattle mink, whose name is just a combination of the Japanese for the word bull ushi and the Italian masculine suffix iano. So it's not Ushiano, it's Usciano. Unfortunately, Usciano is the deputy we know by far the least about, and all I can really say right now is that he is a cow man with a speech impediment, and assumedly he can also achieve a Sulong form, becoming a much bigger cow with a much bigger speech impediment. But that is all 4 blues covered, so let's get into the serious zone now with the G Army, or the Gami if you will, as this is the revolutionary pod dedicated to operations within the Grand Line itself, so it needs to be particularly powerful, and that is why Dragon made Emporio Ivankov the commander of the G Army. Ivankov happens to be a childhood acquaintance of Bartholomew Kuma. The two of them met as slaves during the God Valley incident, which Dragon was also present for, and Ivankov would later become one of the original members of Dragon's freedom fighters. As mentioned previously, Ivankov was given the very important mission of infiltrating Impel Down. The plan was to have Ivankov spend however many years in the prison, gradually freeing prisoners and turning them to the cause of the Revolutionary Army, with the idea in mind to eventually stage a mass breakout when the time was right. And whether it was right or not, that the time did come, which was when Luffy infiltrated Impel Down on his own, and after discovering that Luffy was Dragon's son, Ivankov decided to pull the trigger and break out with his gathered army of newcomer candies. And since then, Emporio Ivankov has played an integral role by offering his island as a temporary base of revolutionary operations, following the attack on Baltico by the Blackbeard pirates. And rather curiously, Ivankov seems to have rather superior knowledge of the world nobles, as he was the one who was able to identify the very familiar Emu as potentially being the ancient Saint Emu Nerona. Otherwise, Ivankov is an absolute beast in combat, and he appears to have powers that are scarily similar to Luffy's Gear 5th. Ivankov fights in such an absurd way with his hormone abilities and generally over-the-top behavior that he borders the line of becoming a cartoon and seemingly warps reality to his imagination. And Ivankov has one of the best possible deputy commanders to complement this, being Inazuma, whose devil fruit ability can cut and warp anything into whatever shape he so desires, although originally Oda intended Inazuma to be the user of a crab zoan fruit, which I also think would have been a pretty damn cool. This character is heavily underrated in general though. He was invaluable to Luffy's group during both Impel Down and Marineford. He's one of the greatest things that this army has going for them. And Inazuma himself does have a bit of Harry Potter syndrome with the scar on his head, meaning that it's very possible that his name Inazuma is a pseudonym, given that it literally means lightning bolt. But with those 5 territories covered, you might be asking, man, on the internet, why doesn't the Revolutionary Army have a dedicated force present in the New World? And the answer to that would be because the New World is the only zone of the planet where the world government doesn't have more or less complete control. So it's not worth them focusing on because the big problem is in the Grand Line and the Four Blues. However, the Revolutionary Army does still conduct smaller operations in the New World in tiny teams, and they are generally led by the Chief of Staff Sabo. This title signifies that he is Dragon's second in command over the entire army, which is quite frankly amazing, because in the grand scheme of things, he's still very young and one of the newer members of the army, which speaks to Sabo's sheer skill, power, intelligence, and most importantly, his drive to purge the world nobles. Sabo himself was born into a lesser noble family, which he despised due to their lack of basic humanity. And so Sabo's childhood consisted of experiencing the rot at the top of the world firsthand, and after a world noble attempted to murder Sabo, giving him temporary amnesia, he would be rescued by Dragon and trained into a man known throughout the world today as the Flame Emperor, and he now has a reputation that may even eclipse that of Dragon himself, with one of Sabo's closest operative allies being Koala, who you may remember from the Fisher Tiger flashback. She was the girl that the Sun Pirate saved, and it was Koala's hometown that proceeded to betray Fisher Tiger, leading to his death. And since that day of injustice, Koala has grown up wanting to build a world where such a thing could never happen again. And Koala was actually brought into the Revolutionary Army at the young age of 14 by the fisherman Hack, who also serves as a close operative of Sabo, but he also has a job as the combat instructor of the Revolutionary Army. The Revolutionary Army often take in child refugees, and Hack teaches them fisherman karate so that they have something to use for self-defense, which also serves as training soldiers should those children choose to stay with the Revolutionary Army. And not only has Hack taught fisherman karate to Koala, but he taught her so well that Koala was able to teach some of its techniques to Straw Hat archaeologist Nika Robin. And speaking of Straw Hat archaeologist Nika Robin, a more subtle revolutionary that you'll see pop up every now and then is Bunny Joe. He's the leader of the group who freed Robin on Tequila Wolf and brought her in to see Dragon, although we don't actually know which army he's affiliated with. Because he found Robin in Tequila Wolf, you'd think he was part of the East Army, because that bridge is located in East Blue. But the anime heavily implies that Bunny Joe is from the island of Toomey in South Blue, with revolutionaries generally being assigned to the island of their origin. And this battle in Toomey is an event that we do see in the manga, but the anime chose to add Bunny Joe into this scene in episode 1132 as one of the local citizens who Kuma was called in to help, thus giving us Bunny Joe's origin story. And also on the odd occasion, you may see this man with a kangaroo hat, which I'm rather fond of due to Australian reasons, but his name is Terry Gilteo. And despite his lack of prominence in the series, he is one of the more integral members of the Revolutionary Army as their intelligence controller. Aside from Dragon, Mr. Terry may be the only person within the Revolutionary Army who knows absolutely everything that's going on at all times. And arguably, he may even know more than Dragon because he wouldn't report all of the small stuff that's not worth bothering the boss with. However, at the time of this recording, our newest member of the Revolutionary Army is Moda, who you may remember from Ace's cover story. But not only Moda, no, she also came equipped with many survivors of the Lelucia Kingdom erasure. Dragon often likes to farm areas of atrocities for new recruits, like he did with Dawn Island and Tequila Wolf. But Lelucia was another prime zone of recruitment, with Sabo escorting the survivors, all of whom have joined the Revolutionary Army, and its numbers only continue to rapidly rise as the world government continue to rapidly cause atrocity after atrocity, with the Revolutionary Army now evolving into a force that may be capable of directly challenging the world government.